Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the DLC Drop Podcast. Today it's my pleasure to welcome my good friend Taylor Johnson. We got to know each other during my time at GameStop and his time with Optic Gaming. Previous to that, he was a performance coach for the San Francisco 49ers. He's going to talk a lot about how to improve your performance, whether you're a traditional athlete, an esports athlete, or a business professional. Let's talk to Taylor. Drop in the untold stories of industry leaders, influencers, and insights on future innovation. I'm John Davidson, and this is the DLC Drop Podcast. All right, Taylor Johnson, my good friend, joining me from Austin, Texas. Thank you so much for joining me here on the DLC Drop Podcast. How are you doing?
Great, brother. Good to see you.
Good to see you as well. So one of the reasons why I'm super excited about this episode, number one, it's just great to talk to you. I always enjoy the conversations that we have, whether they're remote or in person. But you have an expertise and experience on something that so few people either aren't even aware of or don't fully understand, and that is performance training in esports with the background of traditional sports. And so I'm just really excited to share all of what you've learned with our audience today.
Totally. Let's do it.
Fantastic. So a little background for the audience. Taylor and I met when I was at GameStop. This is how most of my, how did I meet somebody start? I was at GameStop, had a fancy title. And you at the time were working with Infinite Esports Entertainment, which had just acquired Optic Gaming. Do I have that right?
Yep, correct.
Right. And so you guys were doing some really innovative things as far as taking pro players and doing physical exercises, physical training. And a lot of people would see that and say, wait, aren't gamers just, slightly overweight, living in their mom's basement, eating Doritos and drinking Mountain Dew? And that is not the case, in fact. And there are all of these benefits. You've helped me learn this, all these benefits to even something that is much more sedentary than running down a football field.
Right.
But give me like a real quick high level of how physical performance training benefits esports athletes.
Yeah. I mean, the whole stigma behind gamers is really interesting, right? It's like you said, everyone's like, oh, well, like they don't do anything. They're just playing games. Like, yeah, they're playing games and they have incredibly high output. And so the way I kind of frame it, and I'll start with how I framed it to the players, because one of the biggest things that I came across, even traditional sports, is like getting player buy-in. It's like really having people buy into the fact of like, hey, we're going to do these things and these things are going to help you improve X, Y, and Z. And the way I framed all of that is, your brain is your moneymaker. Okay. You are a cognitive athlete. You are a high performer. And just as a quick tangent, it's like, I think everybody is a high performer. It doesn't matter if you're a doctor, lawyer, stay-at-home mom, soccer dad, working in gaming, working in any other industry. Everybody's a performer in some way, shape, or form.
Well, we all want to be high performers. Maybe we're not all high performers.
Yeah. So we're all performers and we're striving to achieve something.
Yes.
Right. So there's an arena in which we show up to every single day, and it can look in many different contexts. Right. And so I think with that, there's some fundamental things we can do to improve our performance and consistency on a day-to-day basis. So that's kind of like the context. So then speaking to the gamers, it was like, hey, your brain is your moneymaker. And like, they kind of be like, what do you mean? I'm like, well, what you're doing on a day-to-day basis is you're using a lot of cognitive power, right? You're using energy resources. You're thinking very deeply about the strategy, the technical and tactical aspects of the game. You have teamwork and communications. You're using a lot of resources. And the way to improve not only your performance and extend your longevity is to take care of your health and wellness. So I framed everything around that. It's like, hey, let's try to get you 5 or 10%, even just 1% better in terms of your cognitive output, and just see what happens. And I think for a lot of people, a lot of these gamers, they were like curious. So like, okay, like intuitively they understood. It's like, yeah, my brain's pretty important. Like I think a lot on a day-to-day basis. And then that kind of opened up the conversation around, okay, well, what could that look like? And I think for a lot of things, it's really just meeting people where they're at, especially with gamers, and this goes for a lot of people in general. It's like they only know what they know. And you can't fault them for not having an in-depth knowledge of, deep strategies on nutrition or sleep and recovery and all these other things. So you got to meet them where they're at. Sure. And I think when I kind of framed it to them in the sense of like, hey, we could just do some easy things and let's just see what happens and build consistency and build habits. So really like backing out of all of that. I mean, really it's framing the conversation around behavior change and coming up with easy wins that I call them BAMs. I know you don't swear much on this podcast, but I call them bare ass minimums, right? BAMS.
That's
what are your
acceptable.
BAMs?
Yeah.
Right. It's like, what are your BAMs that you could do on a daily basis that could push you towards this ideal state? And so that's kind of how we framed it. And it was super challenging and a lot of fun. And it was a complex problem to solve. And I think inherently things are complex, but they don't need to be complicated. And I think when you can parse them out and have them in these different buckets and show little bite-sized chunks, well, then the complicated aspect kind of disappears. And then you're like, okay, this is a process that I can follow. And that's kind of how like the conversation started with a lot of these players.
The DLC Drop podcast is sponsored by Ice Shaker. I've been a huge fan of this brand for the past few years, ever since I met founder Chris Gronkowski. What I love about this product is the brand story, the functionality, and the customization. Ice Shaker is a Shark Tank company invested in by Mark Cuban and Alex Rodriguez, owned by NFL players Rob Gronkowski and Chris Gronkowski. I love using my Ice Shaker anytime I'm driving to the podcast studio, I'm going skateboarding, or I'm at the gym. No matter what I'm doing, it just does a great job of keeping my drinks hot or cold. The customization for Ice Shaker is something that's super unique. You can get any name, just about any logo engraved onto your Ice Shaker and delivered to you within just 3 to 5 business days. Get your own DLC Drop branded Ice Shaker at iceshaker.com/DLC Drop. Save 20% on all Ice Shaker products with the discount code DLC Drop. I really love how you're framing that. Number one, what you're addressing here is overcoming whether it's doubt, unbelief, or just not being aware of something based on their experience. But the other thing too is a lot of times, especially strength training, performance training, fitness, we're coming up here on the first of the year at this recording. This episode will come out in 2022, but a lot of people are going to be in that place where they're going to the gym, right? We have our New Year's resolutions, and those things can be intimidating. And I feel like so often it's like I'm doing nothing or I'm doing everything.
Right.
And I get burnt out. Right. And so it sounds like based on your experience, you've got a really great expertise on how to frame this. So it's like, let me give you a bite-sized chunk. Let me get you what you can handle today.
Yep. Get
you interested, understand that this is beneficial, and then grow with that. Is that accurate?
100%. I mean, it's one of my mentors when I was working at the 49ers, he would point out to the weight room and the practice field, and he would say, all of this, the programming, the training, he goes, this stuff is easy. He's like, the hard stuff, and he'd point to the locker room, point to the GM's office, point to the coach's offices. He's like, that's the complex stuff. He's like, it's all about how you frame the conversations. It's all about the psychology. It's about the buy-in. It's about the trust. It's about understanding about where individuals are at, both as, them themselves, but then also as part of that collective unit within the team. And so one of the things you kind of called out, which I thought it's a really good point. It's like, everybody's got different understandings of where they're at. And one of the very first things I did when I started working with esports players is I would just ask them questions, right? I mean, it's like, you got 2 ears, 1 mouth, like, listen twice as much as you speak. So I would just ask questions. Like, so what is the biggest blocker? Like, why haven't you, given where you're at now, like what has prevented you from really getting more into health and wellness and really eating healthier or getting more sleep? Like, you kind of know these things are important.
Yeah.
What's been the biggest blocker? And it came down to 3 things. It was a lack of knowledge, a lack of resources, and a lack of confidence, right? Okay. So that was across a number of different players, right? Probably like 100, 200 different players that I asked this question to.
And are we talking about esports players here?
Esports players, yeah. And I was like, wow, that's pretty interesting, right? It's like, okay, so lack of knowledge, lack of resources, lack of confidence. So then when I was at Infinite and I was the VP of performance, what our team really set out to do, and I had a team of very talented performance coaches that I brought over from traditional sports and some that were also in gaming. I sat down with our team and said, okay, like, what can we do to really help drill down and unpack these blockers? Right. So lack of knowledge. All right, cool. So like, what would that look like on a daily basis? Can we provide them easily understandable insights on how they can improve both lifestyle, or all of these things: lifestyle, mindset, nutrition, movement, recovery? Can we provide resources outside of just educational talks? Can we build a facility? Can we send them home with like foam rollers and lacrosse balls and resistance bands, along with videos on how to do these exercises? And then the third thing is like, if you can handle these first two and frame it and build the container around them having the opportunities to really learn and have authority and autonomy and really take ownership over how they improve themselves, the confidence just comes, right? So it's a byproduct of handling the first two things. And I think it's one of the most important things to do is really assess and say, okay, like, what are the biggest blockers? Let's say you come up with like 5. In this case, we had 3.
Yeah.
It's like, well, what can we tackle first to then have all the others kind of sort themselves out?
Awesome. Yeah, and I'm already loving this conversation here because I feel like there's going to be so many actionable things that people can take away, and the daily person, right? Like, this episode is not just for esports pros or for NFL football players, but I feel like a lot of people who are on LinkedIn, who are in their office working, are going to have a lot to take away. So help me with this. It sounds like when you're starting out, okay, you're giving them the easy stuff first, right? You want to kind of tease it, make it attainable and something to build on. What are those initial things that are effective but also attainable, easy to understand to start out with?
I think first and foremost, what I ask people to do is kind of take stock of like, hey, what is your current understanding around health and wellness? Like, what does that actually mean to you? And part of that is thinking like, okay, here's where you're at now. What is this ideal state in which you want to really strive for? And this kind of goes into like, the barriers or limiting beliefs like you talked about. I'm really big on the psychology, the positive psychology, and reframing, and trying to remove these blockers, these limiting beliefs. So it's like, hey, where are you at now? Where do you want to go? Like, what does that look like? What does that outcome look like?
Yeah.
And then it's like, okay, we have this outcome, this ideal state. What are the behaviors that need to be true in order to get you there? Okay, so then that kind of gives you a bit of a roadmap, and you start to reverse engineer what that roadmap could look like. And then the specifics is like, okay, so you kind of understand like sleep's important. Cool. And, how do you know that's important? Well, I read this study or I heard somebody talking about it. I'm like, well, how do you feel when you don't sleep? I'm like, oh,
tired.
Actually, I feel like, oh man, I actually feel really tired. So let's work through it. It's like, when you don't sleep, John, like, how do you feel?
That's how I feel most days of my life, to be honest with you.
Okay.
Yeah, so let's see. I'm not motivated.
Cool.
I probably lack confidence because I'm not getting done like what I really need to get done, and I'm a little disappointed in myself because I'm like, dang it, John, like, you went to sleep late again.
Yep.
And so I'm also trying to push through barriers that wouldn't be there if I had gone to sleep on time. And I have obviously low energy in those moments as well.
Yeah. Cool. Great. Yeah. I appreciate that. Right. So, the lack of motivation, the mental fog, maybe, it's kind of like you're pushing through jello, your thoughts are like moving through jello. You're like, why is this taking me so long to get to this thought that I know it could get to if I had a little bit more energy?
Sure.
So it's like, okay, so that's your current baseline. And the question is like, well, what if that was different? Like, what if you were able to get just even 15 more minutes of sleep, whether it be on the front end, like the night before, you go to bed a little bit earlier, or you wake up a little bit later. And so again, this is the conversations that I'll have with players and kind of think about like, well, what are these like breaks, like these stress point breaks in which like you kind of fall from grace or you fall from your routine that would be this optimal state. And I try to avoid like all the deep science stuff. I'm like, hey, if you really want to dig into it, we can. And I try to keep it stupid simple and make it very, very relatable to somebody's life and where they're at. So it's like, John, what time do you typically go to bed, if you don't mind me asking?
So I try to go to bed around 10:30.
Cool. And what time do you get up?
I get up around 6:37.
Okay. Do you have trouble falling asleep, staying asleep, or both, or none at all?
I'm a great sleeper, man. I could sleep anywhere at any
Lucky.
time. I when I was traveling the country skateboarding, I was on this 6 month long tour all over the country, and that was one of the questions was, how good of a sleeper are you? Dude, I would
Yeah.
just fall asleep on this in the van while we're,
Lucky, man. I
you know.
wish. I wish that was the case.
Yes,
Cool.
so I am blessed in that
Yeah.
way. However, I do need a lot of sleep. So,
Okay.
some people can operate on less, but so I can fall asleep anytime, but I need it. Like, man, if I'm not getting 8 hours, I'm tired.
Yep. Got it. Yeah. Same. Right. I feel the same. I have trouble more times than not falling asleep than it is staying asleep. And so for me, then, so if I were to use myself example, it's like I know I have trouble falling asleep. So then the things that I do throughout my day to make sure that I could set myself up for success, like what's my win when it comes to sleep, is no caffeine past 2 p.m., is an hour or 30 minutes before bed, I start to wind down and I try to turn my electronics off. I try to pick up a book and read.
That's
I
the
try to do
hardest
some
thing.
breathing exercises. It is. And it is for a lot of people, especially these gamers, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like, okay, so they're playing, they have, let's say, professional esports players. So they have their daily responsibilities as it relates to practice. So they have maybe 2 or 3 scrim blocks. They've got VOD reviews. They've got team meetings, and they have their streaming obligations. Then they may have some partnership or sponsorship obligations. So they're really, and then they may jump in and just play some solo queue and just like grind a game till, 11, 12, 1, 2, 3 o'clock in the morning.
Sure.
That just happens. And so part of it is like saying, okay, well, here's these things that you're doing on a daily basis. Now, we've already talked about what this ideal state of how you want to perform, how you want to feel on a given day is. So what's the gap, right? So like, and can we close that gap? And I think just as a side note on that, I just got done reading this really good book called The Gap in the Game by Dan Sullivan. It's phenomenal, right? And what they talk about is this concept of far too often high achievers and high performers, they put themselves in either one of two states. They're either in the gap of the game,
Oh
which
yeah,
means like
dude.
you're where you are, you know where you want to go, this ideal state, and you live in this gap between where you are and where you want to go. So you're not actually able to appreciate the accomplishments that you've achieved. You're not able to appreciate the present moment. You're not able to look back and say, wow, I've actually come a really long way. And you're not actually able to stack these wins on a day-to-day basis. And so I was kind of doing this even before, like intuitively. Then when I read this book, I was like, oh my gosh, this is gold. And I highly recommend everybody to just even take a look, like read cliff notes on it, just kind of understand that concept. And so part of what I would do with these players is say like, okay, like we know this ideal state. Okay, sleep is maybe one of your biggest blockers. And again, kind of I'm bouncing around and I apologize, but kind of going back to the initial intake questions, it's like, okay, we have these 5 buckets that we know with science that are really important to just overall performance outcomes, right? Lifestyle, mindset, nutrition, movement, recovery, just these things.
Mm-hmm.
So of these 5 things, what seems to be your biggest blocker, right? So for instance, we'll just use sleep. So sleep is like the biggest thing that impacts all of these other factors, both in-game and out-of-game performance. Okay, cool. So let's focus on that. And then part of the framework is then saying, okay, well, your baseline is how you feel today, which maybe you're a little bit tired, a little bit groggy, a little brain fog. Cool. Like what's one thing that we can do to help move you in a direction of this ideal state, but have it be a small enough item or task or behavior change that you could stack consistently.
Yeah,
right?
that'll do it. Because I think a big part of it is like you could have the best weight room in the world, for example, but if you don't ever use the weights, they're useless.
Yeah.
And so what can we get you to pick up today consistently, essentially?
Yeah,
right?
and it's all habit stacking. It's like what BJ Fong out of Stanford talks about habit stacking, where it's basically like you choose one thing that you're doing already, and then you just add a small little modification onto the back end of it. So like in the morning when you brush your teeth, well, as soon as you're done brushing your teeth, you do like 5 push-ups, something like that, right? So you habit stack. Yeah, and Atomic Habits is another. Yeah, Atomic Habits is another great book by James Clear. Okay. And he basically takes the work of BJ Fong and then also adds his own kind of framework onto it as well. And so I know we bounced around a little bit, and I apologize for those that are listening. But kind of bringing it back to, what are the action items or the framework? It's kind of figuring out for yourself and being like, okay, like, what are my strengths and what are my areas of opportunities in terms of how I want to perform on a day-to-day basis? Okay, cool. Like, write those down. Then what's like the one thing, if I were to focus on one thing that would make everything else way easier for me to achieve the rest of these desired results, like, what would that be?
Cloning
And
myself.
What was that?
Cloning myself.
Cloning yourself, right? Maybe one day, I don't know.
Working
Maybe
on
that could happen.
it.
Yeah, working on it. Science will catch up. But yeah, then take that and break it down into small chunks. Like, okay, like I'm going to do this one thing, just this one thing for 2 weeks and just see how that goes and just test and assess and then modify as you need to.
And this is a pretty, I think, commonly known stat, but I can't quite remember. How long does it take to do something for it to become a habit? Is that 30 days or is that another
I've heard I've seen like mixed things on it. Some say it's like 67, like 60 days, or, it's more than for it to really stick. And I'd have to go back and, read the literature on that. I don't know, but let's just assume that it takes longer than you think. Right. So it's like keeping that in mind. And then also knowing like we're human beings, man. Like we got to hold the space for humanity and like what life brings us.
True.
And I think that's one of the most powerful things we can do. I mean, this is another thing, that I always talk to my players about is, self-examination. I talk to a lot of my players about purpose, right? Because a lot of these are just young individuals. Like,
yeah.
I'm like, hey, what's your purpose? I'm just really curious. Be the best gamer in the world. Cool. But what's after that? It sounds like that's a mission in life. That's not your purpose.
Yeah.
Then they're like, oh, that's an interesting concept. And a story about that too, just to kind of like highlight the need for more of these types of conversations in esports. Cause I'm very adamant around, personal and professional development, especially because we're dealing with very young individuals.
Yeah.
So I was at Optic, we had Optic League of Legends team. And I had a pretty good relationship with a lot of those players, one in particular. And I'll never forget him, man. He calls me one day and he's like, Coach, I'm freaking out. Like, what's going on, man? I'm like, oh, like clear the room. Like, talk to me, man. What's up?
Yeah.
And he's like, I woke up this morning and realized that I am not going to be a professional gamer for the rest of my life.
Whoa.
Kid's 21. And I was like, yeah. So how do you feel about that?
Hard reality. Yeah.
Yeah. Hard reality. He goes, I'm scared, man. He's like, I don't know what I would do if I didn't have this. I'm like, okay.
Wow.
So let's work through that. Like, let's worst case scenario. What does that look like? And we did a whole fear setting exercise. And I did that only to show him that his worst fear really isn't that bad, but then also show him like a path forward and say, okay, look, man, you've acquired all these amazing skills of being a professional player.
Yeah.
And they're all transferable if you choose to see it that way. So it's just a reframe and a shift in his perspective of what he had achieved up to that point. And again, like the gap and the gain, right? It's like there was this gap of reaching its professional level. There's this gain to get to the professional level. Then he's like, well, what's next? And there was this wide open void for him to be like, I don't know what's next. I'm like, dude, isn't that awesome though? Like anything is next for you.
Wow.
You can do whatever you want if you choose to see it that way. He's still playing to this day, which is awesome, but I still talk to him and we have those conversations and really try to drill down. It's like, for me doing this work in gaming, even when I was working in traditional sports, I said it all along. People are like, man, you must have loved football. Like you were coaching football performance for like 10 years. I'm like, no, actually, I never loved football. What I loved is the people. Like I care more about the people playing the game than the game itself. And so for me, making the jump from traditional sports to esports, it didn't matter because it's all the same. I'm just working with human beings that are trying to achieve great things in life.
Wow. So I'm hearing the word purpose, and I worked with an executive coach over the last year, and that really helped me in a number of ways and become a better leader, increase my confidence, and also recognizing my purpose, what I want my legacy to be. Mm-hmm. How were you able to personally discover your purpose, and what can we share with the audience to help people discover what their purpose might be?
Yeah, sure. So my take on purpose, that's a good one. It's to be a little bit vulnerable too, right? So, and I have no problem with that. So I was in a relationship with a woman who challenged me every day. She's like, what's your purpose? She really called me forward in a lot of ways. And, oftentimes when you're in a relationship, I mean, that's the Buddhists say, like, the fastest way to enlightenment is relationships, right? Because they call you forward in ways in which like you never thought possible.
Sure.
And it pushes you to your edge and you find your limit. And she'd always question me, like, what's your purpose? Because she knew at the time when we were dating, I was really unhappy. I was really struggling to kind of find my stride. And it's like, I don't know what my purpose is. Like, I'm trying to figure this out the best I can. And that relationship ended, and it really broke me open. But, I'm incredibly grateful for her.
Yeah.
Because it showed me so much in my life. And in that moment, I was like really thinking like, okay, well, what is this purpose, this thing called purpose? And I had a good buddy of mine who does a lot of men's work and leads retreats, and his whole thing is on purpose too. And I used to think my purpose was to create, lead, and serve. Right. Those are kind of like the three buzzwords that I had. And I thought about that. And it's, yeah, it feels really true for me.
Yeah.
And then after that relationship ended, I took some time to really kind of dive into that and think about it more. And I really started down this whole path of, self-examination and really looking at like, what makes me tick? Like, what is the full authentic expression of myself? What does that look like? How do I navigate the world, the conversations that I have? What are my relationships with others? But first and foremost, relationship with myself. And really what I came back to is like, my purpose is to know myself. Like, my sole purpose in this life is to truly know who I am. What are my triggers? What excites me? What do I like? What do I don't like? How do I manage conflict? It's this constant refinement of self. And when I got to that, I was like, oh, this is the most badass game I will ever play. The game of life is the coolest game you will ever play. And I'm like, well, the more I know myself, it's almost like I'm giving myself cheat codes to figure out how to play this game called life.
True. Good point.
And I'm not saying it, the game in sense of like, villain, victor, all these different things. It's like, no, man, like I want to play all out. Like, I don't want to be in the stands. I want to be on the court playing all out. The only way I can do that is to know who I am. And so, and this kind of goes back to the limiting beliefs. It's like, okay, well, where am I holding myself back in my relationship to myself, and then my relationship to others? So what I realized is like, I'm a man of one purpose, know myself, with many missions.
Right.
So then it's like, okay, my mission right now, working with performance, and esport players. My mission is also working at State Space, project manager, where I consider myself a high performance project manager, where I'm coaching up teams, building culture, building leadership, developing individuals, both for professional life and personal life.
Yeah.
Also have other many missions outside of work, so that's kind of what I've landed. And that's like the most freeing thing for me, being like, okay, it's not something outside of myself. It's all internal.
Interesting. So what has been one thing that maybe people can pursue themselves, but has been effective in helping you get to know yourself?
A lot of journaling. A lot of journaling, self-reflection. I mean, people, it's not like a, hey, dear diary, although sometimes I do that. It's kind of fun to be like, hey, dear diary, dear Taylor.
Yeah.
But I think really it's like taking time to do an honest self-assessment and say, okay, like, how did I do today? One of the things I picked up from a podcast with Hugh Jackman is he writes out declarations every day. Okay. So every day in the morning, he says, okay, today I am going to accomplish this. But he writes it as if it's past tense, like it's already happened. He goes, I'm going to wake up. I'm going to be an excellent father, an excellent husband. I'm going to attack my day with focus and clarity and presence. And at the end of the day, he looks back and says, okay, like, how'd I do? So I think doing that is a great practice.
Yeah.
And you can do it in easy framework. Personally, I wake up, I do three points of gratitude. I write like what I'm the possibility of. Like, I'm the possibility of, navigating my day with presence, calmness, and clarity. Cool. And then I basically say, okay, what are my top 3 wins that I want to go after today? Yeah. And then at the end of my day, I look back and say, well, how'd I do? And then if I didn't accomplish those things, it's not like, oh, like, shame on me. I'm like, okay, well, why didn't that happen? Did I get in a funk? Did I have a conversation that kind of knocked me off the rails and then it took me like an hour to get back on? Like, cool. Like, well, why is that? So it's this constant process of self-examination. And I do that with my players too.
Yeah.
You know, I think again for a lot of these young individuals, I mean, even people that I work with too, like within companies and organizations, it's just getting them more self-aware. It's like, okay, am I getting triggered? Cool. Like that's awesome feedback. Like, why am I getting triggered? And what kind of tools can I then use at my disposal to then free me up from allowing that to impact me?
Yeah, what I'm hearing from you is essentially you're creating these daily goals, kind of these mini goals.
Yep.
And I think one of my favorite quotes on goals, I'm going to butcher it, but is if you don't plan where you're going, you'll end up somewhere else.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
it's one of those funny things that when you think about it, you're like, yeah, that's right. You end up somewhere, but if you're not purposeful,
Yep.
right, then you don't know where you're going to end up, and it most assuredly will not be where you would desire.
Yep.
Uh, the other part of it is the more often that we course correct, we will stay on course more consistently. So if I
Mm-hmm.
made a example, other side of the coin, if I made a 1 year goal and at the end of the year, I evaluate how did I do, I could have gone pretty far off course because it was 365 days where I maybe, let's say if my goal was to run a marathon or something, right? Like I could end up at the very end, it's like, oh shoot, I didn't go running at all this
Yep.
entire year. Or I started 1 week and then I stopped and I never looked back at it. Now, if I think to your point, if every day I'm saying, hey, I'm going to go for a run, let's say it's a mile for sake of the example. Now, maybe I don't make it a mile, but I ran, right? Or if I didn't run that day, I am resetting myself to say, not a year from now, hey, will I start running? But the next day saying, hey, I didn't run. What got in the way of that?
Yep.
And I'm going to make sure that I run today.
Yep.
And
Yeah.
so
And
it's
it could
this
be,
constant
yeah,
just tweaking is what it sounds like.
totally. Yeah, it is. I mean, it's all, I mean, that's kind of like the game of life, right? I mean, and part of like the goal setting too is like being really clear. It's like, hey, I want to run a marathon. Cool. Do you want to just complete the marathon? Do you want to be competitive? Is there like a time you're trying to beat?
Good point. Yeah.
Is there like a pace you're trying to set for like the first X amount of miles? Like all these things kind of matter. So I think it's getting really clear. And then you kind of reverse engineer what that could look like in terms of, you know, like how your training program looks.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think the way my mind works is very much in like structure, systems, and scheduling, right? I think that's why I loved creating blueprints and training programs.
Yeah.
You know, but I love that in the sense of if you have a framework, then that allows you to be incredibly creative and flexible within that framework. And I think there's another side of it of, you know, you can have like an idea of where you want to go in mind, but also, and life happens and you're going to shift and pivot. And that's totally cool. It's actually pretty exciting because if everything in life was just linear, I don't know about you, but I think that's pretty boring. I'm like, okay, well then I do this thing, I get this thing, go on to the next thing. And I think that I myself have like experienced that. It's like, you know, going from college to the NFL was a huge milestone in my life.
Hmm.
And I didn't really get how big of a deal that was until I left the NFL and was like, wow, that was actually really cool. But I never gave myself the time to appreciate the hard work and dedication, the long hours, just the grind to get there.
Yeah.
And then when I left the NFL, everyone was like, you're crazy. I'm like, no, this actually feels really good to leave because I see something else ahead of me. But then I didn't actually pause to look back and be like, wow, like that was a pretty big feat. And I'm really proud of that.
Yeah, that's something that I've been guilty of in the past is simply not appreciating what I'm doing in the moment. And I remember very specifically, I mentioned a little earlier, I was on this skateboarding tour for 6 months straight. Now, when I first got on this tour, I thought I was going to do that for 10 years. You know, I was like, I discovered the thing I want to do. It's amazing. I found it. I'm doing it. And it only lasted 6 months. I broke my ankle very badly at the end of that 6 month tour. The company kind of moved on without me, and I kind of had to look at what was next in my life. But I didn't appreciate that because I thought it was going to last forever.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the benefit of that is I have had so many amazing moments since then where I recognized the importance of appreciating what I was doing while I was doing it. In fact, you could even say this situation right here, right? Like here we get the opportunity to sit here and create a piece of content that a bunch of people are going to learn from and have an enjoyable conversation. And that could either go by without us really thinking about it, or we could say, man, how lucky are we? How fortunate are we that we get to have this during the workday, you know?
Yeah. It's really cool. Yeah, it's cool. I mean, that's awesome, right? I mean, and your story is an interesting one too. Like a lot of people kind of go through these things where they think they've got it, and then something happens. In your case, you broke your ankle. You know, it didn't happen to you, it happened for you, because it then opened up so many new opportunities that you would have never experienced. It's like, who knows? You and I would have probably never met if you hadn't broken your ankle, and if you had continued on for the next 10 years, you'd be in a completely different trajectory of your life.
I have no life skills, that's for sure. Just skateboarding. I don't know if I would have learned anything that was any useful off a skateboard.
I would disagree with that, right? It's like the same conversation I had with my player, you know, who said, I don't know what I'm going to do at 21. You know, it's like there's a lot of transferable skills.
Yeah.
It's just how you choose to look at it. And you're right. I mean, it's like taking those moments. And I think it's interesting, especially like, you know, when COVID hit, you know, it's like everybody was kind of locked down. They had a lot of time to process and look at things. Some did, some didn't. You know, that's the choices that they made.
Right.
And life, I think, kind of like came to like a full stop. And you're like, wow, what is important to me? What are the things I'm working on? What am I doing with my time during the day? You know, like just a quick note, it's like over Thanksgiving break, I did a vision quest out in the desert in Arizona.
Cool.
And it's something I've wanted to do for a very long time. And it was 4 days and 3 nights in the desert. I had a couple of gallons of water. You're totally sober. I had a tarp and a sleeping bag. And it was myself, my water, and my sleeping bag, and nature. And like, that's it. And
how did you survive without a cell phone?
Well, dude, I got to tell you, man, it was one of the most interesting experiences, because like the first couple of days, it was like this unraveling of like all of the, like just fatigue of like being on my phone, being on my computer, nonstop go. I mean, traveling, phone calls, Zoom, whatever. And then having to come full stop, and then having this realization, it's like our day is super long. Like you have no idea how long the day is until you have nothing to do except sit and just be there. And I had like a 20 by 10, I'm fortunate I had a 20 by 10 kind of quest site. You know, some people had much smaller, so I could at least like pace around a little bit. But it's like, you know, you sit there and the only concept of time is sunrise and sunset.
Oh, wow.
And then every 4 hours, you know, like the facilitators at the camp, you know, they have these massive drums and they bang a drum every 4 hours for like 10 minutes. One is to kind of give you some concept of time.
Sure.
Two, it's like to let you know that they're holding space and, you know, they're sending out prayers for you because they know how challenging that is.
Yeah.
And, you know, it was like the third day was probably my best day, where I woke up and it was the most glorious sunrise I'd ever seen. And my mind was completely clear. And I had this entire day of just clear, fluid, just like it's hard to explain, right? But it was just a beautiful, magical day. And then that sunset was like insane, like one of the most insane desert sunsets I have ever seen. And it finally clicked. I'm like, this is it. Like every day is a beautiful masterpiece, right? And so what are we doing to contribute? Each day is a masterpiece that we can create for ourselves. We write our own stories. And so what are the choices that we're making on a day-to-day basis that continue to take us from day to day?
You know, a deep psychological question is, if there's a beautiful sunset and nobody sees it on Instagram, was there a sunset? I'm just kidding.
Right? No, I get it, man. It's like part of me was like, man, I really wish I could take a picture, you know, but here's the interesting thing too, right? And I had a conversation with one of the facilitators because we were talking about the sunrise and sunset. He goes, man, like, you know, everybody gets that every day. I mean, granted, you know, depending on where you are in the world, he's like, but that masterpiece was created just for you. It's like your perspective, your take, your angle, you know, that was just for you. Everybody gets that.
That's really cool. You know, I went through a period where I was off of all of social media for about 3 years. And well, I was on Twitter because esports industry is on Twitter. I think about a year and a half I was off everything, and then I got on Twitter, but didn't have, you know, Instagram, Facebook, Snapchat, whatever. And I used to be the type of person that was just so validated by what people saw I was doing. So I got into a place where, more than me just enjoying the things I was doing, I didn't really enjoy something unless somebody validated it via like, comment, share, etc. Right? And something that was so incredibly healthy for me was not having the channel to share online eliminated that unhealthy behavior.
Yeah.
And so I really went through something for a little while where I was like, wait a minute, if I do something and nobody sees it, do I even enjoy it? And the healthy aspect that came out of that was, guess what? I don't do anything I don't enjoy if nobody sees it, because nobody's seen it except for me. And then I learned to enjoy, like skateboarding especially. You know, I've been filmed since I was, 12 years old on a skateboard. And so I'm used to, even before social media, people pointing a camera at me, people seeing it and being validated in that way, right?
Yeah.
And skateboarding is very much, you know, you do a hard trick, you document it, you share it. And it was a struggle for a while to really even enjoy skateboarding, the thing I love doing more than anything else, without documenting it. But what it did at the same time as I worked through that was it helped me gain an appreciation for not just doing the hardest trick on my skateboard, but the act of skateboarding itself, how it felt to roll around, how catching a kickflip and, you know, rolling away or grinding on a rail or whatever, those little smaller, deeper details beyond what you would just see in a video clip. And it's made skateboarding more enjoyable for me in the long run.
Oh, I love that, man. That's good work, man. That's good work. I acknowledge you for really kind of seeing that for what that was too, and like kind of removing that psychological hook, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's doing the work, really.
And the other thing too is, you know, you talk about sharing with stuff. You know, we have a habit of just throwing content onto the internet and seeing what comes back. And so just because I didn't have social media didn't mean I couldn't share stuff. So instead of posting, you know, that beautiful sunset online, for example, on Instagram, I would send it to like 4 or 5 of my closest friends. And guess what? It's they actually care, because I care about them and they care about me, rather than that was cool, keep swiping, you know? Well, I want to get back to, you know, I love the trail we're going down here, but I want to get back to a little bit of traditional sports and esports training. What are some of the biggest differences in the training? And then what also are some things that are very similar that people might be surprised about?
Yeah. So there's way more similarities than differences, which kind of shocked me when I was first. I mean, the whole story for me is, you know, I was in the NFL. I was coaching for the San Francisco 49ers. We were an absolutely terrible team. We made it through one coaching change. I didn't think we were going to make it through another. I had opportunities to go to other teams. And I was like, you know what, if I'm ever going to make a move into something else, because I kind of felt that was coming. Yeah. Now's the time to do it. The NFL will always be there. And so a good friend of mine was like, hey, you should check out esports. Like, I really think there's something there for you in that. And I'm incredibly grateful for him to kind of like put that on my radar, because I had known of it. I just didn't realize how big it had gotten. Sure. And so when I started to really unpack that and look at like, okay, so there's teams, there's organizations, there's coaches, there's players, there's schedules, there's in season, I'm like, whoa, there's a lot of similarities here. Granted, the biggest, I think, obvious difference is, you know, the physical output. Sure. You have individuals that are sitting down in static positions for long periods of time compared to any other field or court or, you know, whatever sport, traditional sports, you know, where they're actually moving in space. They're running, jumping, moving in space. I was like, okay, cool. Like, I can get past that. Like, that's not a big deal to me, because there's still this level of output. And so for me, when I really looked at it, and again, a lot of my thought process in programming and creating periodization and really looking at like the layers in which you can develop programs for individuals comes from one of my mentors, James Smith, who's a very, very well sought after performance, like physical preparation coach, and does a lot of high levels consulting for teams and organizations in other industries. And for him, is like these governing dynamics, right? So there's these 5 things that are universal across the board. You have cultural, psychological, physiological, neurological, and tactical.
Okay.
Okay. So cultural, psychological, physical, neurological, and tactical. And part of that is saying, okay, if we take a step back and we're looking at these individuals that need to perform this task, there's an outcome they're trying to achieve. Okay, cool. What is the cultural framework of that organization, both as at large and then also within that team? Is that set up in a way such that they can go be successful from a cultural standpoint? Are there team norms? Is there teamwork and communication? Are they doing debriefs? How do they communicate? How do they navigate both in game and out of game as a person and as a professional? Then there's the physiological, right? So what is happening in terms of the food they're putting in the body, the sleep that they're getting? How does that impact their gameplay? Neurological, perception, cognition, and motor skills, which is influenced by their psychological, which is influenced by the cultural, right? If you're in a situation where there's not psychological safety, well, chances are your physiological and neurological outcomes are going to be impacted, right? If you don't feel safe in an environment, well, then your stress level is going to go up.
Good point.
Right. So it's all cascading. These are all connected, which then in turn impacts your tactical decision making. So those are kind of like the big buckets that I looked at. And then kind of like, simplifying all of that, it's like, okay, well, there's in-game and out of game, right? So, in traditional sports, you have in-game things that you're trying to accomplish. For esports, you do as well. Yeah. So that's game knowledge, game sense, mechanical skill, teamwork, communication, and tactical decision-making as well. Okay, so those are all the in-game components. Out of game is, okay, so you have your lifestyle, your psychological or your mindset, nutrition, movement, recovery. So those are kind of like the 2 big buckets with the 5 different components in each one. Mm-hmm. And again, there's a lot of similarities between traditional sports and esports in that sense. And then kind of really focusing on the esports, like, okay, well, what makes the most sense for gamers, right? Like, I'm not going to ask of them to have crazy exercise routines because they don't need that. However, I think cardiovascular fitness is really important, both for longevity and cognitive performance. Like, research shows that. So what's the minimum that we can have them do to at least achieve some sort of desired result in that bucket? We know nutrition is really important. We also know that supplementation, like caffeine specifically, is like rampant in esports. Like, tons of people over caffeinated. So what would that look like around education to really say, okay, could we use less stimulants and still get the same results? Well, if we remove one thing, what can we add? And maybe that's in the form of better nutrition, more exercise, more sleep. So a lot of it was just saying, okay, these are all just variables that we're trying to manipulate and adjust based on the individual and the team for their desired results. So it's all the same stuff. And a lot of the performance coaches that I talk to in esports that are either coming from traditional sports or like solely just esports, like, don't overcomplicate it. Yeah. It's super simple, because at the fundamental level, it's all the same stuff. And so for those that are listening too, that are, not a professional esport player, or maybe don't even work in an esport organization, it's like, there are things, very easy, basic things that you can apply, take from the frameworks of traditional sports and how they approach their day. And you can apply that to your daily life if you choose to.
Yeah. So a lot of what we're talking about here are some of the benefits, the things to do that help us. You talked earlier about, cognitive output, and where my mind went are, okay, these are the positive things. What things should we be avoiding that can harm or reduce our cognitive output?
Yeah, I mean, I think first and foremost, like, how you talk to yourself, right? Like, being really aware of like your self-talk. Again, it kind of goes back to self-examination. Like, how do I talk to myself? Like, that's pretty interesting. Like, I'm really hard on myself, like, that's interesting, because that impacts your choices on a day-to-day basis. I think, the obvious too is like, screen time, like, we're on our screens so much. It's like, can I reduce the amount of screen time, especially later in the day?
It's a tough one. Yeah,
it is. I'm not saying it's easy, but could I potentially reduce, like, even like 5-10 minutes, towards the end of my day, to allow me to be able to wind down and have a better night's sleep? I think also like stimulants, people get completely overstimulated. And then that basically leads into like neural fatigue. And then there's, this cascade effect with all of our other hormones that get jacked up because of that. So there's a lot of things that you could start with. And I think it's some of the easy things to kind of the opposite of your question of what to avoid, or things that you could do is hydrate, drink more water.
Yeah.
Drink water with electrolytes, like a pinch of sea salt, or use like a flavorless electrolyte mix. That's really important. Most people are dehydrated on a daily basis.
Oh, yeah. I'm there. Why doesn't coffee hydrate you? It's made out of water.
I wish. And I'm not like, I drink a lot of coffee. Like I love coffee.
Same.
I love the taste of it. And I love the pop you get from caffeine.
Yeah.
And I also acknowledge that like I do build up dependencies on that. And that's why I have scheduled times throughout the year where I get off caffeine completely.
Oh, smart.
And it's like a total reset.
Yeah. Talking about the self-talk there for a moment, I had my coach, Sharon Gill. She was on the podcast. She's the one who's coached me last year and really just changed my life, my mindset.
Awesome.
It's really even hard to even articulate and go back into my previous mindset, and that's
you can't once you see it, you can't unsee it.
Yeah, and so one of the things that we were talking about is this this positive self-talk, and that it really does make an impact. And I said on the podcast episode, I said, Sharon, this stuff sounds great, but are you really telling me that when you look in the mirror and you say, you are smart, you are beautiful, you are blessed, you have favor, like all of these things, I was like, let's check the BS meter here at the door for a minute. And she said, John, tell me, does this affect you? You are ugly. You are stupid. You can't do this. You're not good enough. And I just like felt those things come over me when she said it. And I was like, wow, we are so very aware of negative talk, right? Especially when it's coming from somebody else, like whether it's a parent, whether it's somebody close to you, etc. And it's so important to realize that you can have just as much of an effect the other way in the positive direction through that as those negative words could cause. And I think it's something that very, very few people do. In fact, I'm aware of it. I almost never do it myself.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. It's like, who's the one person you spend the most time with? Yourself.
True. Mm-hmm.
So how you talk to yourself is pretty important, right? And it's like, we're not taught that stuff in school.
Yeah.
And I think like, that's like, and for me, like where I'm at in my stage of my career and like what I'm up to and like what I really want to continue to move into is like just helping people free themselves of that. It's like having conversations like this and be like, there are ways in which you can choose to take back control of your life. And it starts with yourself, right? It's like, how do I want to relate to myself? And then once I get right with myself, but then how do I want to relate to others? And positive, that's why I do gratitude every morning too. Some mornings it's kind of lands like, wow, I'm really grateful for this cup of coffee. Like this is a great cup of coffee. And other mornings it's more profound and deep. And, it doesn't have to be like, you don't have to put even like, we tend to do this too, right? It's like, oh, it has to be right. There's no right, wrong, good or bad. It's just what it is. Well, and so I think kind of getting past that too.
It's also so easy to focus on everything that we don't have and forget everything that we do.
Living in the gap, right?
Right. So
That's
I could say, man, I wish this thing in my life was different, or I wish that was different, or I wish, why did they do that to me, or this, that, and the other, rather than instead saying, wait a minute, I have, like us, we have the opportunity, the time, and the resources to be right here talking to each other and broadcasting this to a lot of people who are going to learn a lot from it. And, I have the opportunity to this. I'm grateful for this, just breath, right? In fact, I saw a quote very recently. My friend Melanie Mack, she's a gaming streamer, and she was on this podcast as well. She posted something. It said something like, if you don't make time for wellness, you'll be forced to make time for illness. I was like, whoa.
It's true. Real talk.
So I think those are the things where, man, there's just so much I got out of this conversation. to leave the audience here with a few things. First of all, tell us how folks should get in touch with you in the way they should if they want to follow you or be a part of some of the things you're doing.
Yeah, I mean, you can hit me up on Twitter or Instagram. It's Coach T_Johnson. You can reach out on LinkedIn. Shoot me a message on there. I mean, it's conversations like this I love having. And I really appreciate you having me on and, the opportunity to kind of talk about this stuff. Cause I don't think it's happening more now than it has ever.
Sure.
And so just continue to share that good message. Absolutely. Yeah, please reach out. Any questions, comments, concerns, you want to call BS on something, go for it. I'm always open to any conversation.
Cool. And because you're such an insightful person and you love to share, give me if you wanted this audience to come away with one thing from this episode, whether we've mentioned it before or whether it's something just on your mind that we haven't talked about, what would that one thing be that you'd want people to come away from?
Oh, that's a good one. Comes up for me most. I think, again, it's like not everybody can go do like 4 days in the desert, right?
Sure.
What I would say, like, give yourself at least, 20 minutes once a week to just be, just be with yourself for 20 minutes, and not even that, it could even be just 5 minutes, just give yourself time to just be and not have an agenda and just kind of sit and just be there. And just see what comes up, then maybe journal about that, so that's one thing is just give yourself time outside of the crazy hustle of life. Just be, you kind of talked about it towards the end, is like, just breathe, really get good at understanding like how important your breath is on a day-to-day basis. You can amp yourself up, you can calm yourself down. It is a very powerful tool at your disposal. And then the third would be to, even if it's just, 3 points of gratitude, is have some sort of journaling practice.
Yeah.
Or some sort of check-in with yourself every day. And that can be kind of parlayed with, giving yourself time, but I think these are the things that are really important and useful as we continue to grow and evolve as people. It's just give yourself the time to sit, to be, to decompress.
I love that. Well, thank you so much, Taylor, for taking the time to spend this time with me and with our audience. It's great to see you again. I learned a lot. I know everybody listening learned a lot. Thank you for joining me today on the DLC Drop podcast.
Thanks, brother. Really appreciate you and acknowledge all the work that you're doing and the impact you're having in the space. Incredibly grateful for you.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the DLC Drop podcast. This podcast is part of the Esports Futuri Podcast Network and produced by Innovation Media Enterprises. Make sure you subscribe on your favorite podcast channel and leave us a review.